February 28th, 2026. 2:47 a.m. Tehran, Iran. 90 million people are asleep. In the span of 4 minutes, the United States and Israel launched one of the most sophisticated, coordinated military strikes in modern history. Operation Roaring Lion, Operation Epic Fury, codenames that sound like movie titles. But this was no movie. By sunrise, Iran's supreme leader was dead, its nuclear facilities were rubble, and the most strategically important waterway on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil flows every single day, had been slammed shut like a fist, closing around the throat of the global economy. Oil prices exploded. Stock markets collapsed. Your gas prices? They didn't go up. They detonated. And right now, as you watch this video, the war is still going. Ceasefire talks have collapsed. Thousands of American paratroopers are loading onto planes. Iran is firing missiles at Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and US bases across the Middle East. And nobody knows how this ends. But here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. This war didn't start on February 28, 2026. It didn't start on October 7, 2023. It didn't even start in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. This war started 2,500 years ago, with the greatest empire the world had ever seen. And the United States of America, a country that didn't even exist yet, would one day betray its heirs in one of the most consequential acts of foreign policy in history. This is the full story of Iran, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you will never look at this war the same way again. Before we talk about bombs and missiles and oil, I need to take you somewhere. This place is called Persepolis. It was the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, and it was built by a man named Cyrus the Great around 515 BC, at a time when the entire Western world was still mostly mud huts and campfires. Let me give you a sense of the scale of what the Persian Empire was. At its peak, the Persian Empire was the largest empire the world had ever seen. It stretched from the Aegean Sea in the west to the Indus River in the east. It covered 5.5 million square kilometers. It controlled 44% of the entire world's population at the time. To put that in modern terms, if you stacked up every person alive on Earth today under the Persian Empire's peak control, that would be 3.4 billion people under one king. But here's what makes Persia genuinely different from every other empire that came before it. And honestly, most that came after the Persians did not rule through brutality alone. King Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, issued what historians consider the world's first declaration of human rights in 539 BC. It's called the Cyrus Cylinder, and carved into it, in ancient Babylonian cuneiform, is the declaration that conquered peoples have the right to practice their own religion, speak their own language, and return to their homelands. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't PR. When Cyrus conquered Babylon, he freed the enslaved Jewish people who had been held captive there for decades. The Bible literally praises him as a liberator, one of the only non-Jewish figures in the Old Testament to receive that honor. The Persians gave the world chess. They gave us the concept of human rights. They built the first postal system in history. They invented the Qanat, an underground aqueduct system that could carry water across hundreds of miles of desert without evaporation, a technology so brilliant that communities in Iran still use versions of it today. Persian poetry, the works of Rumi, Hafez, Ferdowsi, became the literary backbone of Islamic civilization. Rumi's Masnavi is considered one of the greatest works of spiritual literature ever written, and it was written in Persian, in Iran, when Europe was stumbling through the Dark Ages, when London was a tiny backwater village, when Paris was a Roman ruin, when the concept of a university didn't exist in the Western world. Persian scholars were conducting surgery, calculating the circumference of the Earth, writing encyclopedias of medicine, mathematics, and astronomy, that would later become the textbooks of the European Renaissance. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, was a Persian physician born in 980 AD who wrote the Canon of Medicine, a book so comprehensive that it was the primary medical textbook at European universities until the 17th century. 700 years. And then there is Isfahan. The Persians had a saying, Isfahan nes f-e jahan ast. Isfahan is half the world. Because if you had seen Isfahan, with its turquoise domes reflecting in the river, its bazaars that stretched for kilometers, its mosques tiled in patterns so intricate they seemed mathematically infinite, you might genuinely believe you had already seen everything worth seeing. This was Iran. This was Persia. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Because when you understand what Iran was, when you understand that Iranians are the heirs to one of the most sophisticated, culturally rich, scientifically advanced civilizations in human history, only then can you understand the fury that drives modern Iran, the fury at being overthrown, the fury at being humiliated, the fury at a world that treats them like a rogue state when they were building monuments to human dignity before most of the world learned to read. But empires rise and empires fall. The Persian Empire fell to Alexander the Great in 330 BC, though even Alexander was so awed by Persepolis that he reportedly wept when his troops burned part of it in a drunken celebration. The Mongols devastated Persia in the 13th century. The Ottomans nibbled at its western borders for centuries. And then came the 20th century, and with it a new kind of empire. One that didn't come with armies on horseback. One that came with briefcases, bank accounts, and oil companies. In 1908, a British geologist named George Reynolds, after 6 years of failed drilling in the scorching heat of southwestern Iran, struck oil, the largest oil field ever discovered up to that point in history. And the world would never look at Iran the same way again. Part 2. America's best friend. To understand the United States and Iran, you need to understand what the world looked like in 1950. World War II had just ended. Europe was in ruins. The Soviet Union had emerged as a nuclear-armed superpower with the stated goal of spreading communism across the globe. And America, the undisputed king of the New World Order, was terrified, not of losing a war. America had the biggest military on Earth. America was terrified of running out of energy. The United States in 1950 ran on oil, its military, its cars, its factories, its entire economic miracle. All of it required an uninterrupted supply of cheap petroleum. And Iran, sitting on top of roughly 10% of the world's proven oil reserves, was a critical piece of the puzzle. But it wasn't just the oil. Iran shared a 2,000-kilometer border with the Soviet Union. If the Soviets ever gained control of Iran, or even just influence over it, they would have a dagger pointed directly at the heart of the Middle East, threatening Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the Persian Gulf. So for America, Iran wasn't just a business opportunity. It was a strategic necessity. Enter Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. The Shah was, by any measure, a complex man. He was Western educated. He studied in Switzerland. He was modernizing Iran at breathtaking speed. He wanted Iran to look like Europe within a generation. And he was deeply, almost desperately aligned with the United States. In exchange for cheap oil access and cooperation against the Soviets, the U.S. gave Iran enormous amounts of cash, sophisticated weapons, and, crucially, early nuclear technology under President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program. Let me say that again. The United States gave Iran nuclear technology, the same nuclear program that the US and Israel just bombed in 2006. America built it. This is the kind of historical detail that tends to get quietly swept under the rug. But before we get to the Shah's fall, we need to talk about the event that Iranians have never and will never forget. The event that, more than anything else, explains why Iran views the United States not as a partner, but as a predator. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh, and in the history of Iran, he is something close to a saint. Mossadegh was Iran's democratically elected prime minister. He had been a political activist since the 1920s. He had spent time in jail under the previous regime. He had run for office on a single, burning, simple idea. Iran's oil belongs to Iran. You see, since that first British geologist struck oil in 1908, Iran's petroleum wealth had been controlled by a British company, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which would later become British Petroleum, BP, the same BP you probably drive past on your way to work. Under the terms of their contract, BP kept 84% of all profits from Iranian oil. Iran got 16%. In practice, sometimes less. To give you a sense of how obscene this arrangement was, in 1950, the British government collected more in taxes from Anglo-Iranian oil than the Iranian government received in royalties from their own oil. And the conditions for Iranian workers at these facilities were, there is no other word for it, colonial. Iranian workers were segregated from British staff. They lived in different housing, ate in different cafeterias, had different pay scales. In their own country, on top of their own oil, Mossadegh stood up in the Iranian parliament in 1951 and said, enough. He nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. He took back the oil. The crowd went berserk. He became the most popular politician in Iranian history overnight. Time magazine named him Person of the Year in 1951. He was compared to Gandhi. He was giving speeches at the United Nations. He was the democratically elected face of a new, sovereign Iran. The British were furious. They immediately blockaded Iranian oil exports. They tried to strangle the Iranian economy. And when that didn't work, they picked up the phone and called Washington. What followed was one of the most consequential covert operations in American history. The CIA and Britain's MI6 organized a coup. It was called Operation Ajax. Here's how it worked. CIA operatives arrived in Tehran with suitcases full of cash, millions of dollars, equivalent to tens of millions today. They bribed military officers. They bribed newspaper editors to publish propaganda against Mossadegh. They paid street gangs to dress up as Mossadegh supporters and commit violent acts so people would turn against him. They organized pro-Shah military units. On August 19, 1953, the coup went active. Pro-Shah mobs, paid for with CIA money, stormed through Tehran. The military surrounded Mossadegh's house. He was arrested, charged with treason against the Shah, who had barely been in power. The democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest. He died in 1967, having never been free again. The Shah was restored to power. American and British oil companies resumed operations. The oil kept flowing. The profits kept going to London and Washington. And in Tehran, in the tea houses, the mosques, the universities, the homes of every family that had supported Mossadegh, something was forever changed. They now knew something that would define Iran's relationship with America for the next 73 years and counting. That the United States of America, for all its talk of democracy, freedom, and self-determination, would overthrow a democratically elected government to protect oil profits. Not the oil. The profits, that knowledge doesn't go away, it gets passed down. In whispers at dinner tables, in the sermons of clerics, in the angry essays of university students, in the revolutionary pamphlets of a generation that had not yet been born. The CIA coup of 1953 didn't just remove a prime minister. It planted a seed of fury that would bloom 26 years later into the most seismic political revolution of the 20th century. But before we get there, we need to talk about what the Shah did with his second chance at power, because it's one of the most extraordinary stories of modernization, corruption, and ultimately self-destruction in modern history. The Shah took the billions in oil money and built a modern country. Highways, universities, hospitals. The Tehran of the 1970s looked like a Western European capital. International airlines flew direct. Western musicians performed there. Iranian women attended university in greater numbers than almost anywhere in the region. The Shah's White Revolution, as he called his modernization program, genuinely transformed Iran's infrastructure. Literacy doubled. Life expectancy climbed. A middle class emerged. And then the Shah kept going. But there was a shadow on all of this progress. The Shah's secret police force, called Savak, was one of the most feared intelligence agencies in the world. Trained by both the CIA and Israel's Mossad, Savak had files on almost everyone in Iran. Any political dissent, any criticism of the Shah could result in midnight arrest, imprisonment, torture, or disappearance. Amnesty International in 1976 reported that Iran had the highest number of political prisoners in the world. Thousands of people, intellectuals, journalists, union organizers, religious leaders, simply vanished into the Shah's prisons. And while the elite of Tehran lived in luxury, while the Shah's court threw parties that would have made Caligula blush, rural Iran was being left behind. Farmers were losing land to wealthy developers. Traditional communities were being bulldozed to build highways. Inflation was climbing. The gap between the rich and the poor was becoming a canyon. And then, in 1971, the Shah did something so spectacularly tone-deaf that it would go down in history as one of the greatest political miscalculations of the 20th century. He threw a party, not just any party, a $100 million party, at the ruins of Persepolis, the ancient ceremonial capital of the great Persian kings. The Shah hosted world leaders for a celebration of the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire. The guest list read like a who's who of global power: kings, queens, presidents, princes. The Shah flew in 50,000 bottles of wine from France, in a country where many people were going hungry. He imported food from Maxim's of Paris, one of the finest restaurants in the world, to cook for his guests. He had elaborate air-conditioned tents erected in the desert, decorated with flowers flown in from Europe. Meanwhile, in the countryside, Iranians were starving. The images of that party, broadcast on television, printed in newspapers, did something that 1,000 underground pamphlets could not have done. They showed people exactly who the Shah was and who he wasn't. He was a king, not of all Iranians, only of the ones who could afford a ticket. In the holy city of Najaf, Iraq, a 69-year-old exiled Iranian cleric watched the footage from Persepolis with cold, furious eyes. His name was Ruhollah Khomeini, and he had been waiting for this moment. To understand Khomeini, you need to understand the Iran he grew up in. He was born in 1902, just 6 years before the British discovered oil. He came of age as Iran was being carved up by foreign powers. He watched the CIA take down Mossadegh. He watched the Shah's Savak imprison religious leaders. He was himself arrested and exiled in 1964 for speaking out against the Shah. For 15 years, he sat in exile, first in Iraq, then briefly in Paris. And he watched, and he waited. Khomeini understood one thing that the Shah's intelligence agency completely failed to appreciate: information travels. His sermons were recorded onto cassette tapes and smuggled into Iran by the thousands. Played in mosques, in homes, in the back rooms of bazaars. In a country where the Shah controlled the newspapers, the radio, and the television, cassette tapes became the revolutionary internet. Every tape carried the same essential message: the Shah is not your king. He is America's puppet, and God does not recognize him. By 1977, Iran was in genuine economic pain, despite, or perhaps partly because of, the oil boom of the early 1970s. Inflation was soaring at nearly 30%. Unemployment was rising. Land prices in Tehran had exploded. pricing ordinary families out of cities they had lived in for generations. The Shah, meanwhile, had just announced a new anti-corruption crackdown. But the crackdown seemed to target small merchants and traditional bazaar traders, the very people who were the economic backbone of Iranian cities. In 1978, the protests began. First, they were small. A few hundred students here, some striking oil workers there. The Shah's security forces responded with tear gas, then live fire. People were killed. And in Iranian religious tradition, there is a mourning ceremony on the 40th day after a death. So 40 days after the first protesters were shot, there were mourning marches. And at those marches, some people were shot again. And 40 days after that, more marches, more shootings. The revolution had found its rhythm. By the fall of 1978, the protests had grown into something that no military on earth could have easily contained. On September 4th, the last day of Ramadan, 4 million people marched through Tehran. 4 million. In one city, on one day. Historians estimate that between September and December 1978, somewhere between 6 and 9 million Iranians took part in some form of protest. In a country of 35 million, that is essentially every family in the country sending at least one person into the streets. On January 16, 1979, the Shah boarded a plane. He told the public he was leaving for a vacation. He never came back. As his plane lifted off from Tehran airport, people in the streets below were weeping. Not from sorrow, but from joy so overwhelming it came out as tears. They ripped down statues of him. They tore his portrait from every wall. A2 500 year-old monarchy, from Cyrus the Great to Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, ended without a single soldier fighting to defend it. 2 weeks later, Ayatollah Khomeini flew back to Tehran. An estimated 5 million people turned out to greet him. 5 million people. When a reporter on his flight asked him how he felt about returning to Iran after 15 years of exile, Khomeini said, and this has become one of the most famous political quotes in modern Iranian history, nothing. The reporter, confused, pressed further. Khomeini clarified, I feel nothing. Whether that was a deeply spiritual statement about his detachment from earthly emotion or the revealing statement of a cold and calculating political mind, historians still debate it. What is not debated is what he did next. Within months of taking power, Khomeini had declared Iran an Islamic republic. Sharia law was implemented. Women were required to cover their hair in public. Those who had marched and fought for the revolution, alongside men, suddenly found that the new government viewed them differently than they had hoped. Thousands of the Shah's officials were executed. Then thousands of leftists who had supported the revolution but weren't Islamists. Then liberals. Then anyone who questioned Khomeini's doctrine of Vilayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, the idea that a supreme religious scholar should hold absolute political authority. And then came the event that ended any possibility of the United States and the new Islamic Republic finding common ground. November 4th, 1979. Iranian university students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran. 444 days. That's how long they held 52 American diplomats and embassy staff as hostages. The trigger was simple. The United States had allowed the Shah, who was sick with cancer, to enter the U.S. for medical treatment. To Iranians, this looked like America protecting their oppressor. The students who stormed the embassy called it occupying the den of spies. When they broke into the embassy's filing rooms, they found something that confirmed their deepest suspicions. Shredded documents that, painstakingly reassembled, revealed the scope of CIA operations in Iran. Operations that included surveillance of Iranian political figures, evidence of collaboration with Savak, files that connected American intelligence to the infrastructure of repression that had jailed and tortured thousands of Iranians. For President Carter, it was a disaster. He froze billions in Iranian assets. He severed diplomatic relations. He launched a rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw, that ended with 8 American soldiers dead in a collision of helicopters and transport aircraft in the Iranian desert, a humiliation that became a symbol. The hostages were released on January 20th, 1981, the exact day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, not 1 minute before. Khomeini had sent a message. The United States had lost Iran, and it never really accepted that loss. So it did the next logical thing. It backed Iran's enemies. On September 22nd, 1980, Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, launched a full-scale invasion of Iran. This was a calculated bet. The Iranian military had just been through a revolution. Its generals were being executed or purged. Its Air Force pilots had been thrown in jail. Khomeini had dismantled the Shah's army and was in the process of building a new one. Saddam thought he could win quickly. He was catastrophically wrong. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 years, from 1980 to 1988. It was the longest conventional war of the 20th century. By its end, an estimated 500,000 to 1 million people were dead. Some estimates go higher. Millions more were wounded or displaced. It was trench warfare, soldiers bleeding for meters of ground, then losing it again. It was chemical weapons. Saddam used mustard gas and nerve agents against both Iranian soldiers and, in one of the most horrific acts of the war, against Iraqi Kurds. It was child soldiers. The besieged volunteers, some as young as 13 and 14, given plastic keys and told that dying in battle would open the gates of paradise. And throughout this war, the United States was providing Saddam Hussein with intelligence, weapons parts, and diplomatic cover. There's a photograph you might have seen. Donald Rumsfeld, who would later be the defense secretary who launched the invasion of Iraq in 2003, shaking hands with Saddam Hussein in December 1983, at a time when the U.S. knew Saddam was using chemical weapons. The logic was cold and simple. Iran was the enemy. Saddam was Iran's enemy. Therefore, Saddam was the U.S.'s friend. Even as the war raged, Washington was applying economic pressure. Iranian assets frozen since 1979 remained frozen. Sanctions began building layer by layer, year by year. The goal was to strangle Iran economically, to make the Islamic Republic so weak, so poor, so unstable, that it would either collapse or capitulate. It didn't work. Instead, Iran doubled down on the one thing that would give it true leverage: its nuclear program. Remember the nuclear program that America and Israel just bombed in 2006? The one the U.S. attacked with B-2 bombers and bunker buster bombs? America built it. In the 1950s, under Eisenhower, in the 1970s, U.S. companies supplied nuclear technology to the Shah. The entire early infrastructure of Iranian nuclear capability was American-made. After the revolution, Iran picked up where the Shah had left off and started pushing towards something the Shah had apparently quietly wanted anyway: the ability to build a nuclear weapon. For decades, the Iranian nuclear program was the central obsession of U.S. and Israeli foreign policy. The U.S. and Israel reportedly collaborated on a cyber weapon called Stuxnet, one of the most sophisticated pieces of malicious software ever created, that was physically inserted into Iran's nuclear centrifuge facilities and caused them to self-destruct while showing false normal readings on their control screens. It was, essentially, a cyber-physical attack. Science fiction made real. Iranian nuclear scientists were assassinated on the streets of Tehran in targeted killings widely attributed to Mossad. A physicist, a professor, an engineer, killed on their way to work, with explosives attached to their motorcycles by operatives on motorbikes. Iran named public squares and streets after these scientists. They became martyrs. And Iran accelerated its nuclear program. In 2015, after years of painstaking negotiation, the Obama administration reached what seemed like a breakthrough. the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. Under the agreement, Iran would dramatically scale back its nuclear program. International inspectors would have access to its facilities. In exchange, international sanctions would be eased, giving Iran access to the global financial system and its own frozen assets. When the deal was announced, Iranians poured into the streets of Tehran to celebrate. They held up signs with smiley faces and handshakes. Young people who had grown up with nothing but sanctions and international isolation were euphoric at the idea of rejoining the world. It lasted 3 years. On May 8, 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear deal. His stated reason: the deal was defective at its core. His advisors argued it didn't do enough, that it didn't address Iran's ballistic missile program or its support for proxy groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. Critics, including virtually every European ally and many American national security veterans, argued that withdrawing from a working deal with nothing to replace it was catastrophic. They were right. The day Trump pulled out of the deal, Iran began quietly but steadily accelerating its nuclear program. Not in violation of any agreement, because there was no longer an agreement. Within a few years, Iran had stockpiles of uranium enriched to 60% purity, just a step away from the 90% needed for a weapon. The inspectors were kicked out. And in the Middle East, the pressure continued to build. Throughout all of this, Iran had been building what it called its axis of resistance, a network of proxy groups across the Middle East that could extend Iran's reach and apply pressure on Israel and U.S. interests, without Iran having to fight directly. Hezbollah in Lebanon, perhaps the most sophisticated non-state military force in history, with more missiles than most European armies. Hamas in Gaza, Houthi rebels in Yemen who could shut down Red Sea shipping, militia groups in Iraq and Syria, all trained, armed, and funded by Iran's Revolutionary Guard. And then came October 7th, 2023. The Hamas attack on Israel was the most deadly single day for Jewish people since the Holocaust. 1,200 killed, 250 taken hostage, communities systematically massacred. Israel's response was unlike anything the region had seen in decades. First, a campaign that leveled much of Gaza. Then, a targeting campaign against Hezbollah so precise and so devastating that it has been called one of the most effective, intelligence-driven military operations in history. Hezbollah's leadership was killed one by one. Its tunnel networks were destroyed. Its missile arsenal was depleted. With Hamas degraded and Hezbollah crippled, Iran found itself in a new and uncomfortable position. For decades, it had fought its enemies through proxies, keeping its own hands clean. Now those proxies were gone, or severely weakened. Iran was exposed, and Israel was watching. What followed was an escalating cycle of direct strikes between Israel and Iran throughout 2024 and into 2025. Drone attacks, missile barrages. And then, in June 2025, the United States crossed a threshold it had been avoiding for years. Operation Midnight Hammer. 7 B-2 stealth bombers flew from Missouri. Not from a base in the Middle East. From Missouri. An 18-hour flight. 3 mid-air refueling operations. Then, in the space of minutes, they dropped bunker-buster bombs on Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, Iran's most critical nuclear facilities. Bombs specifically designed to penetrate underground hardened concrete and destroy whatever is inside. A ceasefire was brokered within days, through Qatar. But it was a fragile ceasefire. Everyone knew it, because you don't bomb a country's nuclear program and walk away without consequences. The clock was ticking. The final spark. December 2025. Tehran. The Iranian economy was in free fall. Despite its oil wealth, decades of sanctions had left the infrastructure crumbling. Inflation was running at catastrophic levels. Youth unemployment was over 40%. The rial, Iran's currency, had lost 99% of its value against the dollar since 1979. The spark was, like so many revolutions, almost absurdly small. It started with the price of bread. Within days, the protests had spread from Tehran to every major city in Iran. Demands were simple: economic reform, political freedom, and, increasingly, loudly, the end of the Islamic Republic itself. Zendegi, Azadi, woman, life, freedom. And then, Iran turned off the internet, a complete digital blackout. For days, then weeks. And behind that blackout, behind the wall of silence, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard moved. When the internet came back on in January 2026, the world learned what had happened. Human rights organizations and investigators attempting to verify the death toll reported what can only be described as a massacre. Over 30,000 civilians killed in the crackdown. The number is contested. Independent verification inside Iran is impossible. But the scale, confirmed by multiple governments and international bodies, was shocking even to a world that had grown somewhat numb to Iranian regime brutality. The world screamed. The United Nations called it a grave crime against humanity. European governments expelled Iranian ambassadors. Even countries that had tried to maintain working relationships with Tehran were appalled. Donald Trump gave Iran an ultimatum. Talks began, then stalled, then broke down completely in February 2026. And on February 28, 2026, at 2:47 a.m. Tehran time, the United States and Israel launched the attack. Operation Roaring Lion. Operation Epic Fury. Within hours, Supreme Leader Khamenei was dead, killed in a targeted strike. For the first time since 1979, for the first time in 47 years, Iran was without its supreme leader. The Iran-Iraq War, the nuclear program, the proxy armies, the sanctions, the revolutions, the CIA coup of 1953, the oil, the 500-year-old civilization that taught the world chess and poetry and human rights. All of it, in that moment, on fire. So, where are we right now? March 2026. Day 27 of the war. Let me give you the honest picture, not the sanitized news version. The real one. The US and Israel have been running continuous bombing campaigns across Iran. The targets have been deliberate and surgical. Military command centers, nuclear infrastructure facilities, the headquarters of the Revolutionary Guard, the Iranian Supreme National Security Council headquarters, gone. The Expediency Discernment Council building in Tehran, Isfahan's military research centers, gone. The head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy killed in a targeted strike just this week. But here's what the military briefings don't tell you. Over 1,900 people have been killed, more than 20,000 wounded. Many of them are not soldiers. Many are civilians living near the facilities being targeted. Civilians who did not ask for this war. Who woke up on February 28th in a country at peace, and by sunrise were living in a war zone. Iran is fighting back with everything it has. Hundreds of ballistic missiles and suicide drones have been fired at Israel. U.S. military bases in Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and Syria have been struck repeatedly. Iran's proxies, what remains of them, have activated. Hezbollah has resumed firing rockets into northern Israel, killing civilians. Iran struck Kuwait International Airport with enough force to start a blaze that burned for hours. The Royal Air Force Station in Cyprus, a NATO facility, was struck by Iranian drones. Qatar's massive LNG facility, which supplies much of Europe's energy, was attacked twice. The second time, Iran apparently targeted it in response to Trump's threat to bomb Iran's South Pars gas field. The entire Persian Gulf is a battlefield. And then there is the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That is the distance through which, in normal times, about 20 million barrels of oil pass every single day, about 20% of the world's traded petroleum. 20% of its liquefied natural gas. Tankers from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, all of them have to pass through this narrow channel between Iran and Oman. Iran has effectively shut it down. Not completely, not yet, but enough to spike global oil prices from around $60 a barrel in January to over $100 a barrel now. A 60% increase in weeks. The world screamed. The United Nations called it a grave crime against humanity. European governments expelled Iranian ambassadors. Even countries that had tried to maintain working relationships with Tehran were appalled. Donald Trump gave Iran an ultimatum. Talks began, then stalled, then broke down completely in February 2026. And on February 28, 2026, at 2:47 a.m. Tehran time, the United States and Israel launched the attack. Operation Roaring Lion. Operation Epic Fury. Within hours, Supreme Leader Khamenei was dead, killed in a targeted strike. For the first time since 1979, for the first time in 47 years, Iran was without its supreme leader. The Iran-Iraq War, the nuclear program, the proxy armies, the sanctions, the revolutions, the CIA coup of 1953, the oil, the 500-year-old civilization that taught the world chess and poetry and human rights. All of it, in that moment, on fire. So, where are we right now? March 2026, day 27 of the war. Let me give you the honest picture, not the sanitized news version. The real one. The US and Israel have been running continuous bombing campaigns across Iran. The targets have been deliberate and surgical. Military command centers, nuclear infrastructure facilities, the headquarters of the Revolutionary Guard, the Iranian Supreme National Security Council headquarters, gone. The Expediency Discernment Council building in Tehran, Isfahan's military research centers, gone. The head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy killed in a targeted strike just this week. Trump has given Iran until April 6th to negotiate, or he will begin striking Iranian energy infrastructure, a move that international legal experts have warned could constitute a war crime since power plants and energy infrastructure are supposed to be protected under the laws of war. The world is watching and waiting, and running out of time. Now, we need to have a different kind of conversation. We've talked about the official story, the nuclear weapons, the hostage crisis, the proxy armies, the 30,000 killed protesters. These are real. These are documented. These are the reasons that governments give for why this war is happening. But there are other layers to this story. Theories, some held by respected academics, some by historians and economists, some by geopolitical analysts with impeccable credentials, and yes, some by people you might call conspiracy theorists. But the line between those categories is blurrier than you think. Let me show you what I mean. Theory 1. This war is about the dollar. Here is something that does not get nearly enough attention. In 1974, after President Nixon unpegged the US dollar from gold, the Nixon administration struck a deal with Saudi Arabia. America would protect the Saudi royal family, with its military, its intelligence, its diplomatic cover. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would do one thing: only sell its oil in US dollars. Because Saudi Arabia was the world's largest oil producer, and because other OPEC countries followed suit, this arrangement, called the petrodollar system, meant that every country on Earth that wanted to buy oil had to first acquire US dollars, which meant there was permanent artificial global demand for the American currency, which is one of the primary reasons the US dollar has remained the world's reserve currency for 50 years, which is one of the primary reasons America can run enormous deficits without collapsing its currency. The petrodollar is the invisible engine of American global dominance. Now look at this pattern. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced Iraq would begin selling oil in euros, not dollars. 3 years later, the US invaded Iraq. In 2009, Muammar Gaddafi proposed a pan-African gold-backed currency for oil trade, replacing the dollar. 2 years later, NATO intervened in Libya's civil war, and Gaddafi was killed. Iran, for the past 2 decades, has been actively experimenting with selling oil in euros, yuan, and rubles, deliberately trying to circumvent the dollar system. It even struck deals with China and Russia to trade outside of dollar-denominated systems. Trump, just this week at a cabinet meeting when asked about Iran, said that taking Iran's oil is an option. He added, I wouldn't talk about it. And then he talked about it. And here's the twist that makes this theory genuinely chilling. Iran has now told the world that Chinese tankers can pass through the Strait of Hormuz freely, and it has reportedly offered to allow any tanker to pass if they agree to pay for the oil in Chinese yuan, not US dollars. In the middle of a war, Iran is attempting to dismantle the petrodollar. Professor Lala Khalili, an academic who has spent her career studying maritime trade and imperialism, put it directly in a recent interview. Iran, she said, is trying to challenge the petrodollar regime, which is one of the fundamentals of U.S. empire, by promoting the petro-yuan as an alternative. Whether you believe this is the primary reason for the war, or just one thread among many, the fact that oil is being denominated in yuan in the middle of this conflict is not a coincidence. It is a weapon. This one is more controversial. And I want to be careful here, because it touches on territory that is often weaponized by bad faith actors. But it is a theory that is taken seriously enough to be discussed by academic historians and policy analysts. And it was central to the analysis of Professor Zhang Shuiqin, the Canadian historian whose viral 2024 lecture predicted this war with extraordinary accuracy before it happened. In May 2024, when Joe Biden was still president, before Trump had won the election, before any of this had happened, Professor Zhang Shuiqin sat in front of a camera and told his students that Donald Trump would win the 2024 election, that he would then be compelled by geopolitical pressure to go to war with Iran, and that this war would not go well for the United States. He called it the Iran trap. His reasoning? He looked at historical patterns. He compared the situation to the Sicilian expedition of 415 BC, when Athens, at the peak of its power, launched a catastrophic military campaign against a faraway enemy with complex terrain and strong local resistance, and destroyed itself in the process. Zhang argued that Israel benefits strategically from a scenario where both Iran and the United States are weakened by a prolonged conflict. Because in a Middle East where both the US and Iran are exhausted, depleted, and damaged, Israel emerges as the dominant regional power. He described certain factions within Israeli politics as holding a vision of expanding Israeli influence from the Nile to the Euphrates, a concept rooted in religious interpretations of biblical promises. Now, let me be clear. This is not a mainstream Israeli government position. Most Israelis do not hold this view. It is a fringe ideology within certain religious nationalist circles. But Zhang's broader point, that the strategic interests of Israel and the US in this war are not perfectly aligned, and that Israel may benefit from a prolonged conflict in ways the US does not, has been echoed by mainstream analysts and former US officials, and his prediction came true with an accuracy that has given his 800,000 viewers on that single video a very uncomfortable feeling. Britain's defense chief said something remarkable this week. He said he sees the hidden hand of Putin behind Iran's war effort. He said that UK intelligence shows Russia has not only been providing Iran with satellite imagery of American warship and aircraft positions, but that Russian trainers had been working with Iranian forces before the war began. Think about that. Russia is providing targeting intelligence to Iran, essentially helping Iran figure out where to aim its missiles at American ships and bases. Why would Russia do this? Because Russia's entire wartime economy runs on oil. Before this conflict, oil was trading around $60 a barrel. barely enough for Russia to fund its military operations in Ukraine. Now it's over $100 a barrel. The Iran war has doubled Russian oil revenue. Russia is now flush with the cash it needs to keep fighting in Europe. Every day, this war in the Middle East continues. Russia's war chest grows. Putin has every incentive to see this conflict last as long as possible. And providing Iran with satellite intelligence costs Russia almost nothing. And then there is China. China is Iran's largest oil customer by far. When Iran shut the Strait of Hormuz, it made a very specific exception. Chinese tankers can pass freely. China is the one country in the world Iran is actively protecting. And remember, Iran is now demanding that ships pay for oil in yuan, not dollars. If that becomes even partially normalized, if other countries start routinely buying Gulf oil in yuan rather than dollars, the petrodollar system starts to crack. Slowly, but it starts. So here is the picture that emerges when you pull all of this together. And I want to be honest, this is analysis, not established fact. Reasonable people disagree about how much of this is coordinated versus coincidental. But consider this. Russia wants high oil prices and American military resources diverted to the Middle East. Away from Ukraine, Russia is providing intelligence to Iran. China wants to break the petrodollar system, establish the yuan as an oil currency, and weaken American hegemony. China is Iran's customer and protector. Iran wants to survive. It wants recognition. It wants the sanctions gone and its sovereignty respected. It may also want nuclear weapons. Israel wants Iran's nuclear capability permanently destroyed and its proxy armies permanently degraded. Certain factions in Israel may want something more. And America? America wants cheap oil, a stable Middle East, and to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. These interests don't all align. They don't all conflict. They overlap in messy, dangerous, unpredictable ways, which is exactly the kind of situation that starts world wars. Professor Jiang Shui-Qin had one more prediction in that viral lecture. He predicted the U.S. would lose this war. He argued that Iran's geography, mountainous, vast, with a population of 90 million people who have spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario, would turn any ground invasion into a catastrophe. He compared it to Athens in Sicily, to America in Vietnam, to Russia in Afghanistan. Iran has been preparing for this situation for 20 years, Jiang said, and has many more advantages over the United States. Whether he is right about this final prediction, we may be about to find out. So, the question everyone is asking, where does this end? Let me walk you through the most likely scenarios. Not predictions, possibilities. The fog of war is very thick right now. Scenario 1, the Karg Island seizure. This is what military analysts consider the most likely next step if diplomacy fails completely. U.S. elite forces, likely Marines with air support, seize Karg Island. It's a small island, lightly defended compared to the Iranian mainland. You don't need a ground invasion of Iran to take it. And once you have it, you control 90% of Iran's oil export revenue. The theory is that this would be so economically devastating to Iran that it would force the regime to the table within weeks. No oil exports, no money, no ability to fight or fund proxies. The problem? Iran has already told the world what it would do if this happens. Iran's scorched earth option: burn the oil fields, destroy Karg Island's own infrastructure before the Americans can capture it, contaminate the oil terminals, make it economically useless to anyone. We've seen this before. In 1991, Saddam Hussein set Kuwait's oil wells on fire as he retreated. The fires burned for months. The environmental and economic damage was staggering. If Iran does this at Karg, or worse, if it blows up the South Pars/North Dome gas field, the largest natural gas reservoir on Earth, shared between Iran and Qatar, the economic consequences would be almost impossible to calculate. Oil at $150 a barrel, possibly $200. A global recession that could be worse than 2008. Supply chain collapses. Energy poverty across the global south. Europe going dark in winter. Economies that have barely recovered from the post-COVID inflation crisis being pushed back into crisis. Mutual economic devastation forces everyone to the table. America's stock markets have already hit record losses. Iran is being bombed back to the Stone Age. Gulf states are sick of Iranian missiles landing in their territory, a deal that nobody likes but everyone accepts. Iran gives up its nuclear program permanently, under intrusive inspection. The US lifts key sanctions and unfreezes Iranian assets. Iran opens the strait. Karg Island is not seized. Khamenei's replacement tries to establish some kind of legitimacy. Neither side claims victory. Both sides can live with it. The problem is the trust deficit. Iran has been attacked twice by the US during diplomatic talks. Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2005 happened while negotiations were underway. Trump attacked again on February 28, 2026, while a new round of nuclear talks was just getting started. Iran's foreign minister has said, essentially, how can we negotiate with someone who bombs us when we come to the table? And Trump has said he is not desperate to make a deal. Scenario 3, the collapse of the regime. The third possibility, the one that Israel and some American hawks are hoping for, is that the combination of American bombing and economic devastation causes the Iranian regime to collapse from within. A coup, a popular uprising, the Revolutionary Guard fragmenting. This scenario has some logic to it. The regime killed 30,000 of its own people just months ago to stay in power. That level of brutality suggests a government that is genuinely frightened of its own population. And now, on top of the protests, there are American bombs. The economy is destroyed. There may be no supreme leader. Khamenei is dead, and the succession process is, by all accounts, in chaos. But here is the problem with this scenario. Even when brutal regimes collapse, even when the people rise up, what comes next is rarely clean or simple. Iran is not a small country with a small government. It is a deep state with 47 years of infrastructure, a massive military, thousands of Revolutionary Guard personnel with guns and ideology, and a population that, whatever their views on the Islamic Republic, is deeply historically nationalistic. The Iranians who marched for Khomeini in 1979 wanted freedom from the Shah. Many of them did not want Sharia law and theocracy, but that is what they got, because revolutions are not controlled by the people who start them. They are controlled by the people who are most organized, most ruthless, and most ready to pick up power in the chaos. Whatever happens, whoever wins or loses this war in the military sense, the Middle East that exists after this conflict will look fundamentally different. The petrodollar system will be under strain it has never faced before. The U.S. Gulf security relationship is being tested in ways that may permanently shift it. The question of whether Iran can be a constructive member of the global community, a question that was tantalizingly close to an answer in 2015, when Iranians danced in the streets at the nuclear deal, is now further away than ever. And the 90 million people of Iran, the heirs of Cyrus the Great, of Rumi, of Avicenna, of the civilization that built Persepolis while Europe was in mud huts, those 90 million people are watching their country be bombed for reasons that have deep roots in 1953, in 1979, in 2003, in 2018, in decisions that were made by people who are long dead. I want to end this with something that is not a political statement. It's just a human one. Before any of this, before the revolution, before the hostage crisis, before the nuclear program, before the sanctions, before the bombs, there was Iran. There were 90 million people with names and families and dreams. Iran is not a small country with a small government. It is a deep state with 47 years of infrastructure, A massive military, thousands of Revolutionary Guard personnel with guns and ideology, and a population that, whatever their views on the Islamic Republic, is deeply historically nationalistic. The Iranians who marched for Khomeini in 1979 wanted freedom from the Shah. Many of them did not want Sharia law and theocracy, but that is what they got, because revolutions are not controlled by the people who start them. They are controlled by the people who are most organized, most ruthless, and most ready to pick up power in the chaos. Whatever happens, whoever wins or loses this war in the military sense, the Middle East that exists after this conflict will look fundamentally different. The petrodollar system will be under strain it has never faced before. The U.S. Gulf security relationship is being tested in ways that may permanently shift it. The question of whether Iran can be a constructive member of the global community, a question that was tantalizingly close to an answer in 2015, when Iranians danced in the streets at the nuclear deal, is now further away than ever, and the 90 million people of Iran, the heirs of Cyrus the Great, of Rumi, of Avicenna, of the civilization that built Persepolis while Europe was in mud huts, those 90 million people are watching their country be bombed for reasons that have deep roots in 1953, in 1979, in 2003, in 2018, in decisions that were made by people who are long dead. I want to end this with something that is not a political statement. It's just a human one. Before any of this, before the revolution, before the hostage crisis, before the nuclear program, before the sanctions, before the bombs, there was Iran. There were 90 million people with names and families and dreams. There was a woman who went to university in Tehran in 1974 and came home and told her parents she wanted to be an engineer. There was a man who ran a small carpet shop in Isfahan and took his son to see the Great Mosque every Friday. There was a girl who memorized Hafez, a boy who wanted to play football for the national team. None of those people started this war. None of them voted for the Islamic Republic in the way that word is usually understood. Many of them marched against it and were killed for it just months ago. And now they are living in a war zone. The decisions that led to this moment were made by a small number of powerful people over 7 decades. Decisions about oil, about ideology, about fear and pride and power. The people paying for those decisions, the people who have always paid for those decisions, are the ones who had no say in making them. The war is still going. The missiles haven't stopped, and nobody knows what happens next. But one thing is certain, this isn't just Iran's story anymore. It's ours. If you've made it this far, thank you. This story deserved to be told in full. Please share it with someone who needs to understand what's happening and why.